Welcome to our third special episode of Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast, where we rebroadcast one of our Writers for the Sea seminars. Today's panel was recorded live in late July with best-selling novelist Lisa See, who wrote The Island of Sea Women, and Jim Toomey, the creator of the Sherman's Lagoon comic strip. So welcome to Writers for the Sea. It's a project of Blue Frontier. You can find out more about Writers for the Sea at bluefront.org or go to our Facebook page and join 1,000 authors and fans of literary, salty writings. Our last live event was pre-pandemic at the Society of Environmental Journalists in Boulder, Colorado, back in 2019. This is our third live on Zoom event since then. It's today's theme is fiction for the sea. Our guests include the New York Times bestselling author Lisa See, that's S-E-E, and her most recent book, now in paperback, is Island of the Sea Women. And we're also joined by Jim Toomey, syndicated cartoonist, creator of Sherman's Lagoon, that's been in 250 newspapers, 30 countries. And of course, every time I got to thank Jim for illustrating our book, 50 Ways to Save the Ocean. Of course, fiction for the ocean's wide-ranging, would include books like The Odyssey, Moby Dick, The Little Mermaid. The range of ocean fictions can go from a story of a fraught friendship between two women, multi-generational trauma and mass killings, to an imaginary lagoon full of talking fish. And that's what we have today with these two authors. Let's start with you, Lisa. I mean, did you always want to be a writer? Start out as a little girl writing stories?
Well, actually, no. My mother was a writer and my mother's father was a writer. And I think I just really didn't want to do that, like we all are, sometimes a bit rebellious about it. But actually, I did have a lifelong apprenticeship. I sometimes joke around, it's a good thing they weren't plumbers, but why couldn't they have been brain surgeons?
So, and a lot of your novels and also your nonfiction family history on Gold Mountain are all set around China. Island of the Sea Women is, it's set on Jeju Island in Korea with the Henyos. And I'm told it started in your doctor's office.
Yes, I was sitting in the doctor's office, flipping through a magazine, waiting to be called in. We've all done that. And I came across one small article, one small photo about the divers. I ripped that right out of the magazine and brought it home. And I knew even then that I would write about them, but I was working on something else. So it truly, truly was on the back burner. But I have a lot of ideas back there on the back burner. And when I have free time, instead of, knitting or gardening or going to the movies, I love to do research. That's the big treat of my life. And I live very close to UCLA. I love to before the pandemic, I loved to go over there and just spend an afternoon in one of the 7 research libraries there. So I, was slowly collecting material, but it wasn't until, I guess it's about 8 years ago now, when UNESCO gave the divers the designation of an intangible World Heritage tradition. And part of the reason UNESCO did that was that they were anticipating that within 15 years, so actually about 5 years ago, so 10 years from now, that this culture would disappear from the earth. And by that time, I knew that a lot of these divers were in their 70s, 80s, early 90s. And here's the thing, if you want to interview people in their late 80s, early 90s, you take a big risk waiting 5, 10, 15 years to go interview them. So it became very important to do it now. And I'm so glad that I did, because if I'd waited till last year, obviously would not have been able to go. I don't think this year it's even possible. And I frankly am a little dubious about next year for that kind of travel.
Right. And as a nonfiction writer, I realized in reading your book, it's incredible, but I also realized you got to do as much research as any nonfiction. When did you first go to the island and just talk about the incredible amounts of research?
Right. So I guess it has to be about 4.5 years ago now. And, it was just incredible. I interviewed people from the Oceanographic Institute, people at the Henyo Museum, different researchers. I interviewed a woman who had been collecting Henyo diving songs for the last 40 years. So trying to find people like that, but the main people that I was there to interview were the divers themselves. And they were just fantastic. They really have some, big personalities. So they're quite loud because their ears have been damaged by being under the sea at such depths for so long. They really are confronting life and death every single day. And so I think partly because of that, they have this, I guess you'd call it black humor. They have really great senses of humor. They love to joke. They love to tease. They love especially to tease men. And so there were really three categories of women or ways that I interviewed them. Sometimes it was in their homes. These were very in-depth interviews, one-on-one, that would last 2 to 8 hours. Then I would go to where women were going into the sea or coming out of the sea at the end of the day of work. And those were very much catch as catch can, just walking up to total strangers and saying, oh, can I ask you some questions? So those interviews were by their nature quite short, but I can get a lot from those short interviews. Sometimes it's just a fabulous line. Sometimes it's a way to build consensus. And then the third group were women who are retired or semi-retired, maybe getting over an injury, who sit on the shore and collect and sort the algae and seaweed that's washed ashore overnight. And once again, those interviews, just by their nature, were very short. And sometimes I'd walk up to someone and say, oh, can I interview you? And they'd be like, and again, loud, no, go away, we're busy. And sometimes they'd say, sure, sit down. And 5 minutes later say, okay, now you can go away, I'm busy. But again, those short interviews are just a terrific way to get, a great line, to build consensus, to take a story. There was one I heard on the first day that I just couldn't believe. And then every time I would interview someone, I'd sort of ask, oh, what do you think about this? And over again, people said, oh, yeah, that's right. But I do remember this one woman who, when I approached her on the beach, she shouted out, I was the best Tenyo. Now, they all say that, they love to brag. So, I was the best. No, I was the best. But this woman actually may have been the best because in the Henyo Museum, they had big photographs of her in the galleries. They had a documentary about her that ran on a continuous loop. Anyway, there was one point when she leaned forward to me and she said, I was so good under the sea, I could cook a meal under there. And I just thought, I write that down because it was such a fabulous line, first of all. I could never make it up. But also it just tells you so much about how they looked at the sea and the pride that she and other women would take in the work that they did.
So did any of them invite you to free dive with them, or did you try free diving?
No, I can swim, and I did practice in the pool trying to get this straight head down position. I could never really do it. These are people who have spent their lives free diving, who are trained to do it. This is how they make their living. I'm not a professional diver, and I just didn't think it was appropriate for me to do.
So, Jim, as a child, did you imagine to grow up and be a cartoonist?
Well, you don't really grow up and be a cartoonist. Those two things sort of conflict. But I guess, my story is a little bit like Lisa's, except that I came from a family of engineers and I wanted to rebel against the engineering thing. So I sort of became a writer because of that. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just been an engineer to begin with. I didn't come to writing. I'm not a natural writer. It's really like pulling teeth for me. The writing part of the cartoon, there's the writing and the drawing. The drawing for me is easy, but the writing is tough. So no, I never imagined myself a cartoonist. I kind of fell into it after getting bored with a lot of more conventional jobs, and I had nothing to turn to except turning pro with my hobby.
Briefly, tell us your career path, since unfortunately everybody thinks they have a novel in them, and most of them, it will stay in them. But getting to be a syndicated cartoonist, people don't think about how you go about that.
Right. Well, 20 years ago, it was a coveted job and it was a very difficult thing to pull off. Now, I'm not sure I would encourage anybody to try because the industry is pretty much dead or almost dead. But back in the day, what you really needed to do to become a syndicated cartoonist was, I think there's one piece of advice I always give cartoonists, which is, and this is true for writers and anyone in the arts, is if you're not getting enough rejections, you're not trying hard enough, and you're not casting a wide enough net, and you're not taking enough chances. So rejection is definitely a part of a cartoonist's life, like it is part of a writer's life or a singer's life or whatever. I think with syndication, it's kind of a weird industry. There's only about 4 syndicates that distribute to all the newspapers in the nation, and these syndicates are looking for specific things. And if they already have a cartoon about a little boy and a toy tiger, they're not gonna take your cartoon, even despite the fact that it's an excellent cartoon or whatever. So they're looking for variety in their portfolio, and that's probably true with publishers as well. So you could have the greatest book in the world about the ocean, about sharks, and if your publisher or your syndicate or your distributor or whatever already has a lot of shark books, it could be the greatest book in the world, but they're not going to take it. So the best artists, the best authors in the world get rejected all the time, not necessarily because of the quality of their work, but because the particular business associated with their art does not see a fit for that product, if you want to talk about it in those business terms.
Well, when I first met you in 2000, you and your wife, Valerie, she was wearing a string of pearls, and I immediately recognized Sherman the shark's wife, Megan, wears a string of pearls. So how did you become sharks, and how did the other sea creatures evolve? What got you to take a sort of left wing at the shoreline?
Well, most of my writing is autobiographical. When you have to make it up every day and you have a deadline every week, you really you can't just pull material out of thin air. It's really life experience that I pump into the strip every day. And sometimes it's marriage gags, sometimes it's family gags. So I put a lot of sort of analogs in the comic strip that fit my life. So Sherman is a facet of my personality. He's the guy who's going to say the dumb thing at the dinner party and bring the whole thing to a screeching halt sometimes. And I've done that a couple of times. And my wife, I kind of pour her personality into Megan a little bit. And so the marriage conflict dynamic or whatever, the love story is kind of reflected in that. And Sherman and Megan had kids the exact same time that we had our first child. So there's a lot of autobiographical material. And, humor is really all about, in my opinion, it's all about recognizing yourself in the humor, and that, I think laughter is an act of recognition. You see somebody, being a comedian trying to be funny or being funny. And it's really, I think, the reason we laugh at it, the reason we're amused by it is because we see our own life in it. So I try to, stick to real life, kind of a real life foundation to most of my comic strips, most of my gags. And that, I think that hits home with a lot of readers.
I remember when I opened your comic strip one time and saw Megan announcing she was going to have a pup, calling you up to congratulate you. And indeed, you were having your own pups.
Right. Exactly.
And it's all sort of, I guess, to a degree, autobiographical. Lisa, you said you didn't want to initially, you were rebelling against being writers like your parents. And yet a lot of your novels are about China and heritage and women that come out of your own life experience.
Well, actually, I wouldn't say that my books are autobiographical at all. My mom was a writer. All of her novels were extremely autobiographical. The people would read them and say, "Oh, are you this kid?" To me, "Oh, are you this character?" And so I think partly because of that, I've really tried to stay away from that. That said, there's a lot of my emotional life that sneaks in. There was a point a few years ago when one of my publishers bought some books that were out of print. And they came one day, in the mail with these new jackets. And I don't go back and read my work because I wrote it. I don't go back and read it. But, they came, they had these new jackets I was flipping through. I really didn't remember much about the characters. I didn't remember much about the plot. Every once in a while I think, oh, this is pretty good, but I really didn't remember that much about them. However, no matter what page I turned to, I remembered exactly what was going on in my life at that time. Oh, my son had gotten in trouble in school. Oh, my husband and I had a disagreement about something. And my emotional life completely infiltrates day to day into the writing in ways that I'm really even now not completely aware of.
So in Island of the Sea Women, the central characters, these two women who have this, incredible bond that shatters in the course of the incredible violence they confront, and sort of this never quite come to a reconciliation until generations passed. Who are those
let's
characters?
Just say I struggle with forgiveness. Just personally, I struggle with forgiveness. And, if there are people out there who've read others of my books, that I've kind of tiptoed around forgiveness in different books. In Snowflower and the Secret Fan, two best friends, a bad thing happens. They split apart.
Mm-hmm.
Spoiler alert, Snowflower dies. So the end of the book is really more about atonement. In Shanghai Girls, two sisters, a bad thing happens. They split apart. That book actually required that I write a sequel. And the two sisters, Pearl and May, do find forgiveness, but they are on separate continents. They have no way to communicate. They only see each other on the last page. I could go through book by book. And so this time I knew going in that no matter what, I wanted to just look at forgiveness straight on. And that this was going to be the major sort of emotional theme of the book. And when I was thinking about, I knew that I wanted to write about the Haenyeo and about Jeju Island. And so I looked at this sort of larger history of Jeju. I went back about 1,000 years to when it was its own independent kingdom, the period of the Korean kings, Manchus take over, the Mongols take over. So, it was and still is kind of a stepping stone out there in the Pacific that different people have wanted it at different times. Anyway, all of a sudden I get to the 20th century and all this stuff happens. The Japanese colonial period, Sino-Japanese War, World War II, the 4-3 incident, and the Korean War. So today, and this was a place where there was this 8-year massacre during the 4-3 incident, when between 30 and 80,000 people were killed and 85% of the villages were burned and destroyed. And then that 8 years of violence was followed by 50 years of government-enforced secrecy. So you couldn't talk about it, you couldn't write about it. If you did, you could be sent to prison, tortured, killed, and so could everyone else in your family. Anyway, today, this island is recognized internationally as the Island of Peace. It's ranked with Rwanda and South Africa as international models for forgiveness. So I knew that if I set the novel in this time period, I could really, look at forgiveness. And we know how forgiveness works in so many levels. It's one-on-one, it's with your neighbor, it's sometimes within families, it's societies and cultures, it's countries. And I thought by setting it in this time period, I could really kind of look at all these different levels of forgiveness.
Right. And sometimes reconciliation is not about individual forgiveness.
Right.
It's about some form of justice. And I think
And for me to sort of do more scholarly research on forgiveness, what all the scientific studies show, but also some more like religious and philosophical ideas about forgiveness. One of the lines that I was very happy that I found is attributed to Buddha: to understand everything is to forgive. And I don't know how true that is. I think it's true up to a point, but it was a line that I ended up using.
And at some level, it also reflects island life, which is, the scale of the massacre is amplified by the fact that it's on an island, and kind of island life, like the life of mariners, fishermen, commercial mariners, sailors in the Navy. I mean, it's quite separate. There are 8 billion people on the planet, but on any given day, there are only about 50 million on the sea. And there aren't that many small islands in the world, or large islands.
Right. And this particular island, is pretty isolated. The seas are very rough around it. It's about 100 miles from Japan, about 100 miles from Korea, and about 100 miles from China. So, 3 straits. And then on the other side, on the western side, there are about 1,000 miles of open sea. And so it's very windy, the seas are very rough. And so historically, the people on that island had been quite isolated from not only the other countries around them, but from the rest of the world.
And Jim, you're, along with being very funny, you also have both in your cartoons and in your animations, you've addressed some of the serious issues that are encompassing. I mean, island life, ocean life is changing rapidly. I mean, we're in a crisis moment, between industrial overfishing and pollution and loss of habitat, climate change. I mean, people's lives are changing. You've tried to address it with humor, but you've also done a number of works for the UNEP, the UN Environmental Program, and others to try and talk about this with humor but seriousness.
Yeah, cartoons, they sort of let you get away with a lot, because I think when people, cartoons and animations, so static cartoons, comic strips, and things like that, as soon as somebody sees a cartoon, they get a little bit disarmed. They're expecting light, fluffy material that makes them laugh, and I try to provide a laugh in my cartoons, even the ones where I'm trying to deliver something more than just a chuckle. But with the UN animations and the other animations I've done for other folks, it's an interesting medium for conveying a lot of information, sometimes serious information. And you can really kind of catch people by surprise with the animation. I did an animation on plastic pollution, and some of the images you can convey, like I covered the whole planet with little plastic bottles, and and then I kind of made the bottles break up the way that real bottles do break up when they get into the environment, and I just kind of ended up with the planet covered with just these tiny little plastic particles. And so those images and the animation behind it really can convey thoughts very, very economically and clearly, a lot more than try that with live action or try to explain that in an article. So there is sort of a kind of a direct connection to the brain through visual that animation takes advantage of. With the comic strip, I kind of describe it more as a sort of a Trojan horse, where, it's disguised as a comic strip. So you let it in the door, and then all kinds of other stuff jump out of it when you do let it in the door. I've done I did a series on shark finning. I've done a lot of plastic pollution. I've done bottom fishing and just all kinds of things. And again, I try to stay true to my contract with my audience, which is to provide a little bit of a laugh, or at least a thought-provoking little story.
Well, I have one of your strips in my office, which is the intellectual fish with glasses. I'm sorry, I forget his name.
Ernest, yeah.
Ernest is asking Sherman. He says, I've got a class project. What can you use shark skin for? And Sherman's like, well, you can use it for shoes. It makes a good sandpaper. And he looks down and says, you could wrap a shark in it.
Right. You can cover a shark in it. Right. That's sort of the, I'm laughing at my own jokes. It's bad. But
well, you've been isolated for a long time.
But and those are really the most effective, obviously, if you can just make somebody laugh, especially if you can make them laugh, conveying an idea that they may or may not agree with. They may not agree with. I got a lot of flack for the shark finning cartoons because I think a lot of my audience didn't expect, topical or political. I don't really consider it political, but so I did get a lot of negative feedback for some of that. But again, I tried to keep it light and funny, and I think it was pretty effective.
Well, I think if you've made a career with cartoon sharks, you have an obligation to make sure that actual sharks exist in the ocean after.
Right. Yeah, years. Exactly.
And in terms of and we haven't had a lot of laughs for the last year and a half. I mean, between the shift out of celebrity fascism and a global pandemic, I know for a lot of writers, it's been hard. Lisa, you were saying that in terms of the pandemic, the isolation, that one of your major projects was sort of put on hold.
Yeah, like I said earlier, I do think about books for a long time before I write them. And so I thought I knew what the next book was going to be. I'd been collecting material for about 4 years, but it was going to require a trip deep, deep, deep into a very remote part of China. And no way I could do that last year. I just really am not sure when a trip like that is going to happen. Anyway, I just was like, now what? Oh my God, now what? Because I like I said, I do think about ideas for a long time. Anyway, this fall, I was walking by this bookcase. I walk by here many times every day, and one of the spines kind of jumped out at me. I don't know why. It was gray with darker gray lettering, so nothing to jump, but I pulled the book down. Reproducing women, childbirth, pregnancy and childbirth in the Ming Dynasty. And I thought, well, I've had this book on my shelf for 20 years.
Oh, me too.
We're in the middle of a pandemic. Maybe now's the time to read it. I got to page 19, and there was a mention of a woman doctor in the Ming Dynasty. That's not so extraordinary, but enough, extraordinary enough to send me to sort of look her up on the internet. And it turned out that she was born in 1460. In 1510, when she turned 50, she wrote and published a book of her cases. So 1510. So I type it in. It's available in English. It's still in print. There aren't very many books in the world that are still in print 511 years later. So I had a copy of that book within 24 hours. And now, as of a couple of days ago, I'm on about page 275 writing about her. And she really was extraordinary. Out of the 12,000 books, medical books, that, historic medical books in China, only 3 were written by women, and hers was the first one. And again, still in print, which is, Jim, I don't know how you feel about it, but just to have anything in print even 20 years later or 50 years later is pretty remarkable. So to have it, so many centuries later. And
hopefully your novels will be available for frontal brain lobe downloads in 600 years.
Who knows? But yeah.
Yeah, and were there book tours? Were you touring?
I had actually gone out on book tour for the paperback for Island of Sea Women. It was supposed to be a 6-week tour. I went to 5 states in 5 days, and then the tour was canceled. It was March 10th was when I went out on tour. And then they sent me back home, which I was.
Where were you when you got sent back home?
I think Wichita.
There you go.
I think that may have been the last state. So, the first, because it's the paperback, the hardcover, you're going to New York and Chicago and San Francisco, but the paperback was sort of these, second tier, what they call second tier cities. And everybody was kind of watching what was happening. So I know the first state was Minnesota. They didn't have a single case of COVID. By the time that I ended the tour, in Wichita, Kansas, they had 2 cases, but they were in another part of the state. But that day, New York declared a state of emergency, and my publisher has a policy that if the state has a state of emergency, then their employees can't travel out of the state. And even though I don't live in New York, they considered me in that instance an employee. My next stop was supposed to be New York, and so they sent me home. I was very grateful to come home, but I certainly didn't expect it to end up as it has, a year and a half later.
And Jim, you're working on your computer mostly now. You don't do the pen and ink cartooning anymore, but I know the pandemic had some effect on you because I saw the videos of you playing bagpipes on your dock.
Right. Yeah. Well, that has more an effect on my neighbors and my family. Everybody says that bagpipes can make you cry. Well, my family cries every time I practice, so I can vouch for that. Bagpipes aside, I think, one of my friends commented that COVID was a gift to introverts, and I don't quite agree with that totally, but it certainly was more punishing to extroverts. And since I was an introvert, for me, a lot of my life just kind of carried on. COVID did change it in 3 significant ways, though. 2 children and my wife, who they all came home to work. My 2 kids came home from school. My wife came home from the office. So my once very tranquil house turned into a complete circus, which is difficult to create, to write. I need like a complete silent chamber with the temperature exactly at 72 degrees and no outward no external stimuli to actually get a thought in my head. So to kind of adjust to that circus life and create and deal with all the trying to keep the kids on track with Zoom school, which was a complete bust, and everything else really was a disruptor for me as a sort of stay-at-home artist.
And I know I love.
May I ask a question? Can I ask a question? Because one of the things that I found for myself was that it was very hard to write in. First of all, my husband was home 24 hours a day, which was we've never had that before. But I found it quite hard to write, especially in the, let's say the first 10 months of the pandemic. I mean, I did, but that there did seem to be this real weight. And so I was especially writing a cartoon where you're supposed to be kind of fun and light. And even though you do have things that you're writing about that are serious, it's not like there's a pandemic outside the window. And I found that to be quite hard, quite challenging. To come to, just anything light in the writing.
Correct. Yeah. And that's so true. And, there was this kind of darkness that came over everything. And we can all relate to that, everybody in the audience. And there were a lot of other things going on besides COVID that made the atmosphere somewhat tense. And so humor became very difficult. And I saw that manifest in television too. These professional comedians, the Stephen Colberts of the world, out there trying to make people laugh, and it's difficult in these times. It was, it bottomed out probably about this time last year, but we're still far from recovered in the humor graph. And I think it's going to take a while for us to kind of get our senses of humor back.
But I think then the other side of it too is, that's humor on one side, but on the other side, I do write. My books are usually pretty sad, and there's always a lot of drama in them. And I sort of feel like people don't want that. We're all sort of living it in a way that we want to have a kind of an escape and be lifted up and feel inspired. And I like to think my books are inspiring, but they are. People are going to a dark place often with them.
Right.
Well, it's part of living in it now, because we're on to even as we've not resolved this one, we're on to the next global crisis, which is, the hottest, stormiest, wildfire burning, record temperatures in Siberia and Western Europe flooding. In terms of the ocean, climate is literally changing the physical nature of the ocean, its circulation, its temperature, its chemistry, its color. So it's kind of like finding humor, finding a new way of telling stories in that sort of science fiction realm we grew up with. We're now living in that post-apocalyptic hellscape, but we still have to find the balance the warning with some wonder and some hope. And I think that's what you both do in your different ways. Just going back.
Can I just say
Please.
too? It's my anniversary, and my husband and I just went up to Half Moon Bay, and I don't know how many people watching are from California, but there's the ugly way back home down through Central California, which is just ugly. But then we decided, sort of spur of the moment, we'd drive down the coast and take an extra night. And it is so brown. I have never seen it look the way that it does. And yet there is such incredible beauty. And to be driving through, along through Big Sur, yes, this side has been burned, but out there, is this incredible force, this incredible part of nature that has so much strength, and it's enduring, right? It's forever. And yes, it's, suffering as the rest of the planet is, but it will be here long after we're gone. And there was something I found, very powerful about that as we were driving home.
It's not just the everlasting sea, it's our relationship to it. And we're always looking, our work is to see if we can grow solutions faster than the problems. And when I spent a few years in DC and came home to California and immediately wrote my book, The Golden Shore, California's Love Affair with the Sea, because we're the solution at scale. 40 million people, the world's 5th largest economy. We've done very good by our coast and ocean. People love what they know, and they know the ocean, they have the access. You can't solve climate in a single state. You can't address some of these big issues, but if you have a state like California, it becomes a model for beginning to do the things that are needed. I know I had great fun. Plus, it's always an excuse. So I went off with the Navy and the Coast Guard and the surfers and got into the ports. And I love the research. Even living alone, though, I in the normal course, I'll find that I can actually do my writing between like 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. I need to have all the phones, stop ringing and all. And what's your normal non-pandemic schedule for your writing, and what's your goal each day? Lisa, Jim.
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, so I'm kind of more of a tradesman than an artist, and I'm not trying to be coy or falsely humble here, but my job is more of a daily thing. I have a weekly deadline, and it appears daily, and I grind it out sometimes. So I'm not a songwriter who can just kind of take time off and reflect and then sort of produce this work of art once every few weeks, or a book writer who might take a couple of years, and their schedule is very probably best described in terms of weeks and months, and mine is really a daily job. It's not really a 9 to 5. It's more, I think I'm more productive in the morning. As you say, when the phone's not ringing and everybody in the house is still asleep, That's a quiet time for me. So 6, 7, 8, 9 in the morning is nice. And then after that, it's really fits and starts.
And then you've said when you're having problems with a gag, your sort of defaults, you can always have Sherman eat a person.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, so there's 4 kinds of gags in my world. There's simple and funny. That's what we all strive for. And then there's 2 sort of equally valuable or unvaluable gags. And there's complicated and funny, and there's simple and not so funny. And those, in my world, I will put them both out there because I have a deadline. And when I put my books together, I kind of just cull the herd a little bit and I get rid of those. But the absolute cardinal sin in my world is complicated and not funny. So I really, when I'm stuck and I just can't think of anything else, I just go simple and visual.
So, and Lisa, what's your schedule and expectation of yourself?
So each book takes me about 2 years. The majority of time is spent on research. The least amount of time is actually the writing, and then the editing is somewhere in the middle. But I do think of it a little bit, just like Jim said, there's only one way you're going to get a book done, and that's to put your butt in the chair every single day. And whether you're writing or editing or doing research, you're doing it every single day. Because you can't, if you have a deadline of 2 years, you can't wait until the last week to write a 400-page book. So it's really, sitting down every day. And just as Jim said, some days you're inspired and some days it's just really not there. But you still have to sit there and I write 1,000 words a day when I'm writing, which is just 4 pages. And there are times I know it's bad. I mean, I know that it's going to be tossed out eventually, but I know that I also have to do it. And because you can't fix something unless you have something on the page. So, and the only way you're going to have something to fix, again, is just, putting your butt in the chair and doing it every day. And I do think a lot, I sometimes, on the book that I'm working on right now, I'm having to work in a sort of subplot. Well, that has an effect. It has a ripple effect on everything. So just to sort of sit and think and think and think and daydream and think, what if? Oh, well, what if this? And that does take some time, but even that, I consider that to be work. I consider that to be part of the process. And I'm sure for Jim that you're probably thinking all the time, if one of your kids says something humorous, you're like, I might be able to use something there. Something happens at dinner. Oh, I could use that. So I think there's a part of, for every type of artist, that there's a part of your mind that's working all the time and thinking about how I can take something that I've heard or seen and incorporate it into the work.
Okay, so all you viewers who want to write a great ocean book, be creative, but you got to do that 1,000 words a day. That's Lisa's instructions, and at least 1,000 words a day. And I know a lot of questions are been posted, so Natasha, maybe we'll let people who are viewing bring in some questions they have.
Sure. Thank you. This was a great way to dive into ocean storytelling, from cartoons to sea stories. And you guys have triggered a few questions. I'll start with Jim, just in terms of your process. It sounds like you're doing most of it on the computer, or do you actually draw and then scan? Can you talk about that for a minute?
Sure. No, I draw it on the computer now. I use a digital tablet and with just Photoshop. So it's sort of what word processors did for writers. It allows us to do and redo and redo and redo and redo, which probably, is it's too much latitude. I think. I think in the old days when I actually put an ink line on a paper and I had to live with it, my art was probably a little bit more interesting because there were a lot more mistakes and just more interesting things visually. But so yes, it's all digital now.
Okay, great.
I know as an old journalist, I started up with manual and electric typewriters. You write a 12-page article and your editor goes, "That's great, but why don't you move that lead paragraph and sort of bring this one up?" And then you have to do 12 pages again. So to me, the greatest technological breakthrough of the last century was not the internet. It was cut and paste on computers.
Right. There you go.
And Lisa, you've done a lot of traveling in writing your books. Do you have kind of any favorites or memorable experiences? And where are you going next?
There's so many, actually. I'll just say three very quickly. The first was when I was in southwestern Hunan province in Jianyang County, where the secret writing system was invented by women, used by women, and kept a secret by women for 1,000 years. And so when I was there, I got to interview the oldest living Nushu writer at that time. I think she was 96. 93 or 96. She died 3 months later. And that truly was, one of the most memorable experiences of my life. I think interviewing the Henyo, there were certain women in particular, again, the ones who were in their early 90s who had just lived through so much history and so much hardship, and yet had this incredible strength, incredible bravery, persistence, courage that I found, very inspiring. Not just, when I wrote the book, but all the way to today, especially actually in this last year and a half or so, that when I would, certain days, when I've gotten kind of down and I just think I'm never getting out of this room. And then I think about these women, what they've been through. So hugely, hugely inspiring to me. And then the last one I would say was when I was working on Tigral of Hummingbird Lane, when I was up in the tea mountains of Hunan. And I have always been a tea drinker, but that book turned me into a total tea snob. So those were the places I think that have meant the most to me. And where I'm going next, I don't know, because I just think we have to see what happens in the rest of the world with COVID.
But it sounds like those Hanyo women, loud and humorous despite their incredible tragic lives. It's kind of like they're as salty as the sea.
Exactly. And I did see a big difference actually between when the book first came out in hardcover and then a year later when it came out in paperback. That in the first year when I was doing events or talking to book clubs, people would say, "Oh, these women, they're so they have so much physical courage and bravery, what they do." I mean, and it's very, very dangerous work. But then after COVID, people really changed how they interpreted the book. And it really was much more about the psychological courage and persistence and endurance. We're so lucky in this country. None of us living have experienced, for example, a war on our soil. So we don't know what that's like to have something happening right outside your window or right outside your front door. And, I think obviously this last year and a half has been very challenging for people who've lost family members, friends, lost jobs. I mean, it's just been, for lack of a better word, pretty brutal. And so I'm very gratified, though, to see how leaders have taken that courage that the Henyo have for what they've, brought by what they've experienced and their emotional strength.
And have you gotten feedback from people on Jeju, on the island, on your book?
I have. However, the Henyo themselves most of them are illiterate. Right. And so there is a Korean edition, but I don't think they've been able to read it. But I have heard, certainly the people who helped me, some of the academic people and scientists there, um, have been very kind, and the book has done very well in South Korea.
Great. Another question for Jim. Do you take suggestions from marine scientists for ocean stories?
No, I do all the time. I know a lot of them out there. For example, just about 4 weeks ago, a good friend of mine does public outreach for Woods Hole. So they wanted to do a whole cartoon series on the so-called Twilight Zone, which is that kind of middle area, not the deep ocean, and not the sunny, top part of the ocean, but that sort of middle area that's kind of hard to research and hard to stay in. And so I did a 2-week series on that, featuring some of the animals, and so we're kind of integrating them into the website and so forth. So, and I do that all the time. I take suggestions from the scientists, but also from folks working in conservation as well. So, I love doing that.
And it's also, Jim does a real trick. He's covered not just shark finning and biodiversity, marine protected areas, ocean acidification, coral bleaching. To get and they're like 5-7 day series. So to get like consistent humor over the state of coral is particularly challenging. If you just went for the yucks and didn't talk about the issues, you'd probably have an easier go of it.
And no, definitely. Whenever I get what I call an assignment, or like any project like that, it takes twice as long to do the work, but it's a lot more gratifying too. Sometimes I just go general. I'll do a 2-week series on something specific, like the Twilight Zone, and then I'll go back to a general interest storyline just to sort of clear things out. But it's a lot harder to write when you're trying to convey information and a gag and tell a story, and you have about 40 words to move that storyline along. Definitely challenging.
You helped in 2018. We did Global March for the Ocean, and you had a series, and it's like, we're going to march, and it's like, we're fish. We're going to die if we go into the air.
Right. Yeah. Flop around and die. Right. Yeah. Sometimes, yeah. I go dark every now and then, but there you go.
Well, I think, just in terms of the messaging around the cartoons and telling these stories about the cultures that live and depend on the ocean, one of our audience said that we're beyond awareness. What else do we need to do to write about, to mobilize people into actual action on the climate crisis and what's happening to our oceans? I know, Jim, you've done some work addressing some of those issues, but I asked this question to both Lisa as a writer and Jim as creating the imagery and the messaging around it. How do we mobilize the public to care about our oceans?
You want to try that first, Lisa?
Actually, I actually was thinking about something you said earlier, that your cartoons aren't necessarily political, or that people will read them and be brought into a subject, even though maybe politically or ideologically they, let's say, don't believe in global warming or global climate change. But through your work, you can actually reach those people through humor. And I think that that's something that artists can do, is that you're reaching people, and talking about stuff that maybe on the surface, at first I think, I'm not interested in that, or I don't believe in that. But through story and through art, you can bring them to it, and you can make them maybe, open the door a little bit, open the window a little bit, and hope that they'll come through a little, and at least peek through. And I think that that's what art can do.
And you can't mistake media for movement. That media can open up, history or identify, serious problems through humor. But at a certain point, people mobilize. And, what you can do is you can talk about empowered women and lives that, you can you can change the narrative from sort of land-based, men going off to kill other men, and the leaders of, of the nations are those who've, managed to, lead armies. And that's not a model for today. So I think, the models we're looking at, part of it is what we get through culture, and then part of it is our individual choices to make choices, whether it's as consumers or citizens.
I'll sort of, I totally agree with what you both said. What Lisa said earlier is so similar to what I was about to say that I'm scrambling to say something different now. I think her point that, as artists, we can put that message, subtle or not so subtle, in different places and different audiences and different, in different minds, and change different minds is important. My comic strip, the funny pages really are read at the kitchen table, in houses all over the country. And they don't really cut across a particular age or political or any other race or any other kind of demographic. They're really kind of universally read. I think that's the power of my comic. What I do is that, I can put that message, and it's short. So a lot of people who may not necessarily agree with my politics will read that cartoon anyway. It just brings, for me, I try to bring that message to a slightly different audience segment than the audience that might watch nature documentaries or go to read the New York Times or whatever. So I think as artists,
but also, there are lots and lots of people in this country who've never even seen the sea, never seen it. And so I'm sure, I was doing research actually in South Dakota a couple of years ago. And I don't know how many of them have seen the ocean or not, but they were seeing the effects of global climate change around them. I was there in summer. They had a saying about corn, knee high by the 4th of July. Well, it was this high, it just wasn't growing. And so they were seeing what was happening, but they could relate it to their fields, to their land, to their storms. And so I think some of this, it's trying to show that, in some regards, that it's whether it's on land or on the sea, things are happening. And you may not actually have an experience of having seen the sea or been in the sea, but that you can take what's happening out there and relate it to wherever you live and what you're experiencing yourself.
And the sea is water. It evaporates. It becomes all the water in our lives, which is life itself. And I think that, I know the incredible crisis and danger we're in, but whenever I go diving or body surfing, I come out of the ocean, I'm optimistic. You, Lisa, just drove down the Pacific Highway and looking out at the Pacific that covers 1/3 of the planet. I know you're an inveterate sailor, and now you're boating a lot, Jim, and I hope to join you shortly. I think the ocean's a unifying spirit, and because it's water and because it's life. And I think that spirit's infused. I'm certainly going to read more of your books, Lisa, but I just thought it was an incredible historical tale to be told of a unique place and a unique group of women who represent something important in history and something we can't afford to lose. And Jim, I just look to you as an opportunity to both laugh and learn, which is rare that you can do that in one place. And I just appreciate both of you for joining us on this with Writers for the Sea, and Natasha for all your work. And it's gonna get posted. And anybody who missed this, who's on the call, tell your friends to check it out. Some amazing artists here today, Jim and Lisa.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Nice sharing this with you, Lisa.
Same with you too. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
And now a word from our sponsor.
That's the sound of a North American right whale. With fewer than 400 left along the Atlantic coast, the right whale will soon be extinct if we don't act now. 80% of their deaths are caused by entanglement with fishing gear, including ropes from lobster and crab pots. That's why we need to begin deploying ropeless fishing gear technology that is both practical and affordable. With your support, we can protect the livelihoods of fishers and the lives of endangered right whales. The Sierra Club Marine Team, because 71% of the environment is salty. To learn more, go to Sierra Club Marine Team on Facebook.
Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier with host David Helvarg and support from Natasha Benjamin, Ellie Curlow, and myself, Vicki Nichols-Goldstein. Rising Tide's editing services and additional technical support are provided by Studio Kate May of San Diego, California. The theme song is written and performed by Ethan Kenbarg. You can find Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast, at www.bluefront.org or download it anytime from Apple, Google, or Spotify.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the blue frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy! Sparky! There you are, good boy, Sparky!